Welcome, everyone, to the Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in humanities, social sciences, and surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. For today's episode, I'm joined once again by my colleagues Tara Ruttenberg and Dr. Pete Brosius. Tara is a PhD candidate in development studies and specializes in critical surf studies and alternatives to development in sustainable surf tourism. Pete's a distinguished research professor of anthropology at the University of Georgia, as well as the founding director of the University of Georgia's Center for Integrative Conservation Research. For this episode, Tara, Pete, and I will be talking about critical surf studies as a field of academic research, as well as their surfing and sustainability study abroad program in Costa Rica. I'm super stoked to have you both back on the show, but before we get started, I'd like to thank you, as well as our listeners, for being part of another amazing episode of the Surfing Historian.
During the last episode, we mentioned briefly what we call kind of the smirk or the eye roll that we have experienced repeatedly, certainly in an academic setting. I get it all the time in trying to explain the sort of critical surf studies research that Tara and I are doing, and in trying to explain our surfing and sustainability study abroad program. People just don't take that seriously, right? And I think in general, a lot of people, particularly in the academic domain, when they think about surfing, they see it as, trivial, superficial, situated somewhere between beach blanket bingo, Gidget, and Jess Spicoli, right? All these stereotypes about surfers, and surfing is this kind of completely trivial enterprise. And I think, it's fair to say that what we're trying to do, both in the research and in the study abroad program, is really challenge that. And I think that's where this whole idea of, critical surf studies comes in. It provides for us, a very powerful and very diverse lens for addressing a whole range of issues. In the last episode, we also talked about all the different kinds of issues that kind of work that we're doing, both in research and teaching, addresses. Issues of race, issues of gender, issues of cultural appropriation, issues of exclusion, displacement, dispossession, histories of white privilege, and the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and I completely understand, Pete, thanks for opening up with that, of course, the whole eye roll thing. And I think we'd all agree that, as we continue with our research or do our research, and, as you said, people don't take critical surf studies seriously. But I guess sort of following up on what you were saying, and maybe Tara, you can chime in a bit on this as well, but I guess the question is, why should it be taken seriously, and what value does, critical surf studies or this field, or viewing academia or research through the lens of surfing, what value does it bring to academic research in and of itself? Would one of you guys like to, or both like to have a look, sort of explain that from your vantage point, I guess you might say?
Yeah, I mean, in our last episode or last interview, we talked a little bit about our study abroad program, and I think there are a few surf-related study abroad programs now. This idea that using surfing as a lens to study these broader issues, in our case, in our program, we focus specifically on conservation, development, issues that communities confront related to surfing tourism realities. And using surfing as a lens, it allows us to recognize that surfers, kind of being on the forefront of a lot of tourism processes in particular, are worthy of study in the ways that they are influencing places in terms of, so social and ecological sustainability, and then also a lot of things having to do with the ways that communities are just changing and affected culturally in terms of what we talked about last time, a lot around surfing and the neo-colonizing processes of tourism that entails. So that's just an example that can be, tangible, using the example of our study abroad program to show how surfing as a lens, and particularly through, sort of this emergent field of critical surf studies, where we situate ourselves in our research, looking at power dynamics related to these interactions that happen in surfing spaces. And we use the concept of surfscapes, which we touched a lot on in our last interview. So critical surf studies really draws attention and awareness to sort of the political interplays that happen both in the water and on land in surfscapes, and also at the level of our cultural imaginaries, or the narratives that connect us as a culture internationally, and that are manifest in different territories locally where surfing happens. And there's been just a proliferation of research really in this field of critical surf studies, addressing some of the issues that Pete just mentioned, related to coloniality, related to gender, related to capitalism, race, and class-based scenarios and realities. And maybe Pete can touch a little bit on that, on the worthiness of critique itself and how that feeds into critical surf studies and our research, and the approach that we take on our study abroad program as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll take it from there and say a bit about what we mean about the critical part of critical surf studies. And it's important to acknowledge that this concept of critical really emerges from a long legacy of work that a lot of people have done over a long period of time, that really draws on a set of ideas concerned with showing how power works in the world in a way that might not otherwise be obvious. And Tara has heard me do this spiel in our program year after year, but and I don't want to spend a lot of time here going into this in detail, because I think this is familiar ground for a lot of people who are doing this kind of work. But you can trace it certainly to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Gramsci and the whole idea of hegemony, Foucault and ideas about discourse and biopower and governmentality. Certainly you can trace it through feminist theory, as well as through this Black intellectual legacy from Frantz Fanon to James Baldwin, through the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and the idea of intersectionality. And then, of course, all those ideas associated with the contemporary conversation about coloniality and decolonizing. And to kind of bring it all home, what it all really means, I think, is that it helps us see and understand how our epistemologies, our ways of knowing, our ways of being in the world, our ways of categorizing are not natural, they're not universal or inevitable, but rather they're historically contingent, culturally contingent, constructed, mutable. And what that means in the end is that they provide us an opening to imagine a different world. And so when we encounter this idea, for instance, of sustainable surf tourism, that a lot of sustainability related, a lot of people who care about the world, right, and think about the state of the world, and think about the impacts of surfing, think about it through that lens. I think it's fair to say that our work is intended to destabilize that a little bit, to challenge us to think beyond a model of sustainable surf tourism.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing, how you all view critical, surf studies or surf studies. And yeah, that's, I agree. And so I do want to, you guys both have mentioned this study abroad, and, just a little bit about it, because I'm, personally curious to know, a bit more about it in and of itself. And again, just sort of dovetail from or segue from what you both were just talking about. I'd like to, maybe you guys could share with myself and the listeners a bit more about your methodological approaches to this research. Like, what do you all do on the ground? So what is this study abroad, and methodologically, how do you go about doing this research?
Let me just, I guess, start by just saying, basically, in terms of what we do, students take 2 courses, one focused on the political ecology of conservation and development, because Costa Rica is this, place known for this incredible commitment to conservation and sustainability. But at the same time, it's also, a real estate like hotspot, right? What we do is we travel from all the way in the south, Pavones, up north to Witches Rock, and visit communities along the way and talk to a lot of people. Having said that, Tara, why don't you talk about all the other kinds of things we do on the program, and then maybe I can come back and say something about ethnography.
Sure. So my role with the program as the program assistant is to set up meetings for the students and provide experiential education components that really can provide a new horizon or a new perspective on things that people who potentially haven't even ever been out of the country, or who are exposed to surf culture or surf tourism realities for the first time in their lives, have never seen before, right? So I've been living in Costa Rica for a long time, and this sort of work is really caught up with my own passion for conservation and development related research within the country. So supporting students to meet with local surfers, surf instructors, visiting tourists, people who own different types of businesses in each of the towns that we visit, local professional surfers, and real estate agents, developers, kind of a broad range of people who are doing different things in the communities to get, they're able to ask them questions and do sort of, visit different places to see a range of experiences that are related to tourism in different ways. So from, camping on the beach at Witches Rock to, visiting a pretty high-end development that's catering to foreigners coming into the country, right? They get a broad range of experiences to kind of, grapple with the differences and the realities that, when we talk about something like surf tourism, it isn't uniform across the spectrum. So that's my role, and one way that I am supporting that sort of experiential education component, and really focusing on this critical perspective as a lens for seeing through surfing. And Pete can talk a bit about the ethnographic approach as a method during our program.
Yeah, so of course I'm an anthropologist, and ethnography is kind of what we do, and obviously a lot of other people in other disciplines also do ethnography. But of course, ethnography, it has its own complicated history rooted in colonialism, and we don't need to go into that. But from my perspective, it's really a kind of listening and a kind of witnessing, and I think it lends itself to of course, ethnographic research typically is a long-term kind of thing, right? Minimum of 1 year. You live in a community, or you follow some other kind of cultural formation through different sites and so forth. But it really lends itself to what we're trying to do in the program. I'm a big believer in I can't remember the exact saying, but good teaching is not telling students what to think, but helping them to figure out where to look, right? And the people that we really want them to listen to a diversity of perspectives. And while that may not be ethnography in the pure sense that anthropology, according to our professional standards of what that means, it nevertheless exposes students to a broad, diverse array of voices in any given community, whether it be Jaco or Pavones or some other place, right? People that they agree with, people that they disagree with, people that they're surprised by. They learn all kinds of things. And we do this thing on the program where we have them, we call it ethnographizing. So, we take them to Dominical and say, go talk to people. Some of our students talk to a guy fishing in the estuary, or to a surf shop owner, to a gringa who whose husband organized the lifeguard society or group, whatever, in Dominical, and they learn things from those encounters and then share them. We also do we have an observation guide, which is kind of a quick and dirty guide to thinking about how, what are you looking at on the beach? What do you observe on the beach? All the gringos, laying out in the sun, and the ticos, sitting on their coolers, in the shade, and what's happening in the lineup? Like, what are the dynamics? Do you see hierarchy? Do you see do you see localism? Do you see all those things? And so, in class sessions, we're talking about the critical side of things, and then we're giving them the opportunity to just listen to people and put it together.
Yeah, and what's so amazing about this critical surf studies or surf studies, or this emerging field that we're all passionate about, is as you said, Pete, methodologically, of course, as a historian, we do there is ethnohistory, of course, so there is some level of ethnography in there, but methodologically, like, what I find so fascinating about it is we all approach this differently. In other words, I think that's what makes what we do so wide-ranging and allows for us all to uniquely engage in academic research in our own way through the lens of surfing. And I think that's another thing that the listeners and others that as you said, give you the eye roll, should understand. We're applying our academic methodologies to this, but we're just viewing it through the lens of surfing. And so I guess having said that, I have a follow-up question before I move on to some of the other things that I hope to talk to you guys about. But this is a bit of a just a somewhat of a fun question. But as far as the study abroad goes, right, it is you're looking at development, you're doing ethnography, and it is a study abroad through the university. But just out of curiosity, what percentage of these students would you say are surfers? And how do they, those that are surfers, how do they respond to the fact that they can weave together their love for surfing and all the while, actively engage in academic research?
So I would say that, interestingly, I would say a relatively low percentage of our students would be considered, surfers. They most have never surfed, or they've had one surf lesson, or they went to Hawaii for a week, or something like that. Having said that, we've also had we had a guy in the program who was the surf coach for Huntington Beach High School, right? So we've had some very, very experienced surfers as well, and our program can accommodate all those kinds of levels, because so for instance, the student who was the surf coach, he is interested in a career in promoting sustainable surf tourism in some shape or form. And so I think he felt, I can't speak for him, but he was very receptive to thinking about some of these issues in ways that I I think, informed him about how to think critically about these claims to sustainability, for instance, and stewardship, and as well as issues related to indigeneity and cultural erasure and appropriation and all those kinds of issues. So I think we make an effort to accommodate all levels. Most of our students, don't go on to, do research, on surfing or critical surf studies. But I think it's still fair to say it's a fairly transformative experience for a lot of them.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. The student we're specifically speaking of, his name's Bryce Leasy, and he actually went on to create a virtual reality project that counted as, I believe, part of his master's thesis project, that showed the differences it wasn't in Huntington, it was in Long Beach. The differences, how development has changed the landscape of the beach. Back, I believe he had footage from the 50s and 60s, and then he showed what it looks like today. So when you put the virtual reality goggles on, you can kind of flash back, and do like a 360 turnaround to see you're standing on the beach, and then present day, you're standing in a parking lot, right? So it's pretty impactful to demonstrate the changes that, have come through development, and he's really kind of bringing back the historical surf culture from those days to talk about conservation and sustainability in the area. Really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And that, really brings me to the other question I had for both of you. I feel like, Tara, you're going to jump on this first, but it's really for both of you guys. But, I'd really like to hear a bit more about at least what you've experienced in your research, and I guess, in Costa Rica as well, about the political ecology of real estate and its connectedness to surf tourism, and I guess surf tourism neocolonialism. I think that's the way you framed it last episode, Tara. So I guess this is for you first, but Pete, of course, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. And I guess sort of before you take it away, Tara, you also talk about this decolonizing sustainable surf tourism critique. So maybe you can unpack a lot of this for me and for others in this answer.
That's a big question, Jason, but I'll do my best. And I think I'll start with the last part of your question and then turn it over to Pete to talk about the political ecology of real estate as sort of a conceptual frame for the research that we're doing on surf localism. So I'll start with the decolonizing critique of sustainable surf tourism. So that comes from a chapter we published in 2017 in the Critical Surf Studies Reader. That's sort of a calling out, really, of the framework that has defined a lot of the research thus far in the field of sustainable surf tourism. And that critique centers on, looking at the field of sustainable surf tourism as perpetuating this discourse of development, right? So a lot of the work that's being done is thinking about how to leverage surf tourism for sustainable development. And the critique we offer is proposing that mindset is still mired in kind of capitalocentric logics in very economistic terms that are focusing on how to achieve economic growth through neoliberal modes, usually through creating income-based approaches to poverty alleviation through surf tourism, and then assuming that there will be some sort of trickle-down effect that is pretty common to these sorts of approaches. So our critique is offering ideas towards moving towards alternatives, thinking about economy in a more open sense, decentering these sort of capitalist logics that think about economy so only in terms of income generation strategies, setting up enterprises, but really looking at more of a kind of integral approach and diversifying definitions of the economy that decenter capitalist logics. So this is building on the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, who have created this sort of post-capitalist politics framework and methodologies to work with communities in discussing and creating alternatives to development. So alternatives to this sort of dominant discourse on sustainable development, specifically related to the sustainable surf tourism field. And that's what we're proposing through this critique. So first, we're critiquing sort of the kind of meta narrative around surf tourism for sustainable development as still mired in these kind of capitalist ways of understanding the economy. And then we're offering this diverse economies approach as a way of working with communities to start thinking about more localist approaches that aren't just based on these models that are often, dictated from international agencies, UN development program that are defining the sustainable development goals, but really more on the ground in terms of how are we surviving well with the communities where surf tourism is happening, and how can we support these sort of more autonomous and endogenous ways of being and integrating with surf tourism that aren't just kind of adopting this blueprint approach, right? So that's really the crux of the critique we offer for sustainable surf tourism, and offering it as a bit of an experiment in thinking through and working into and researching on in a participatory way what can we think of as decolonizing sustainable surf tourism.
I guess I can jump in there, and I guess I just want to say that I think one of the things for me that's been really fruitful about our collaboration, both with respect to research and teaching, is we kind of I think it's fair to say we come from different sort of starting points. So Tara articulated the diverse economies approach and so forth, whereas I sort of initially came to these issues through through political ecology, right? And I don't want to spend a lot of time sort of defining political ecology. I like to say it's really kind of about challenging narratives of blame, right? Oh, those damn peasants, they're cutting down forests. And instead saying, well, why are these people cutting down forests, right? What are the broader structural forces that compel them into situations of marginality and et cetera. And so when I see what's going on in a place like the Bukit, right, I can't help but think about all these questions of displacement, dispossession, simultaneously driven by these narratives of, paradise of the sort that Jess Ponting has written about from the Mental Eyes, thinking about that history that Scott Lederman talked about in one of your podcasts a few months ago about the 1965 genocide and the resulting, complete reconfiguration of economy and society in Bali and Indonesia as, at large. And then also thinking about that kind of economistic, logic of real estate development that is completely incommensurable with Balinese ways of knowing and claiming land, and that is essentially aimed at making the world safe for Remax, right? And that's not just happening, in the Bukit, right? It's happening wherever surf destinations, surfscapes are experiencing this kind of, endless developmental cycle of discovery and development and hyperdevelopment. And I think then that's what brings me to kind of challenge, the sustainable surf tourism narrative as being, as Tara, articulated, this, premised on this status quo set of ideas that really have their foundation in economistic logics. I'm working, kind of outside of my critical surf studies universe. I'm working on an article about of what I call cycles of disillusionment that we see played out again and again and again in the field of development, in the field of conservation, where some approach emerges, whether it be women in development or community-based conservation or indigenous knowledge, and then through time it becomes captured, right, and then it becomes an acronym, right? WID or IKTEK or CBNRM, right? As the World Bank takes it on, and and large conservation organizations take them on, and everybody's excited about, because of their faith in the ability to scale it up, right? It's kind of presented as a silver bullet, a panacea, but of course, Lynn Ostrom reminded us that there are no panaceas. Anna Singh published a very, very interesting article on, challenging the idea of scalability. And really what it is, in my view, and this brings us back to ethnography, is the kind of incommensurability between the simplifying notions of economism and coloniality, I think you would have to say, and the kind of complexity that you encounter and acknowledge through ethnography. And so we see this kind of contrapuntal process repeated again and again historically of some kind of economistic logic premised on simplification, replicability, scalability, challenged by the complexities of local context. And that's why so many people in the economics world, in the conservation world, in the development world, kind of have nothing but disdain for anthropologists, right? Because what ethnography does is in acknowledging complexity, it alerts us to the danger of what Jim Scott called state simplifications, or in the 19th century, right, that a Swiss historian named Jacob Burckhardt, warned us that, and I quote here, the essence of tyranny is the denial of complexity. And so for me, that's where the hopeful challenge to this kind of economistic model of sustainable surf tourism comes in.
Yeah, and as you were talking, thank you both, by the way, for that answers. I guess just a really quick follow up to that before I go into really, I want to give you guys the last word and talk about how surfers at large can contribute or be active participants in this more sustainable approach. But before I get to that, does permaculture, any approach like that factor into some of the political ecology or sustainability approaches or research that you guys are doing in Costa Rica? Because I know it's a huge, seems to be a pretty huge thing in Costa Rica, and is growing in Nicaragua as well. But does that play a role or factor into anything you guys are doing?
Yeah, that's interesting you brought that up. Yeah, in Costa Rica, permaculture and sort of practices of organic and more regenerative agriculture are really proliferating, which is wonderful. And there are a few different models being implemented at the local level. In southern Costa Rica, there's a really beautiful community-supported agriculture project that links up with a lot of the local farmers, and they really just provided transport from the harvest places, from the farms, to a central location where volunteers are kind of packing these weekly baskets full of produce, and then people who are living in the surf towns and surrounding areas buy these boxes, and it's supporting the local farmers and offering organic agriculture to people who are living in the surf town. So that's one example of a way that seems to me to be kind of linking supply and demand in a way that's supportive of these type of practices or regenerative agriculture specifically. And then there's a project that I'm considering proposing. Well, I have proposed and I'm actually awaiting funding on that would link regenerative agriculture and permaculture farms, any type of kind of organic or local farming around the Nicoya Peninsula in the northwest of Costa Rica, to the kind of really growing tourism markets centered around Santa Teresa, which is where I've done my field research for my PhD, which I'm working on finishing up at the moment. So those sorts of things are ways that I think permaculture, regenerative agriculture can really link into the sustainable surf tourism framework. And we're even thinking about, connecting it with some sort of user-friendly digital app that people can see where their food is coming from if they're eating at a certain place. And is it coming from, San Jose? Is it being imported? Is it being produced locally? And then how's it getting to the places where people are? And are businesses kind of tapping into these networks of local producers in different ways? So I think kind of the relocalization movement that's coming together through these permaculture farms and supporting local farmers are really, really meaningful here in Costa Rica, and we're seeing that more and more. That said, the kind of critical flag goes off, of course, because a lot of the permaculture farms are owned by foreigners, and they attract kind of foreigners who are coming to work the land on these farms in a volunteer capacity. But it is kind of exacerbating these issues of dispossession, because a lot of these larger farms are formerly owned by Costa Rican farmers who are now being marginalized and forced out of the places where they have culturally lived, survived, subsided off of their own farming efforts. So the shifts are drastic as well. So again, not denying the complexity of the issue, I think it's an interesting question, and something that I think if surfers are interested in this line of study, it's worth researching and checking out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about land dispossession, and that's really plays a big part of my research in Nicaragua, just the land history and how it's changed hands over time from, land that was large tracts of land owned by, say, a colonel or allies of the Somoza dictatorship, to being redistributed during the agrarian reform. And then with the, you mentioned neoliberalism earlier, with the neoliberalist economic policies introduced and, effectively with the election of Violeta Chamorro in 1990, property became up for sale. And the property on the coast was then bought by, as you were talking about, foreigners. And so, yeah, it really is. I guess I should back up and say the permaculture initiative that I'm familiar with in Nicaragua is really my neighbor, who is a huge advocate of it. And one of the things we want to create is a permaculture community. I guess I want to give you guys, both of you, the last word. And if you could just, both individually give us some, myself and the listeners, some takeaways on how we as surfers, and even of course non-surfers, how we can all contribute to a more sustainable approach to whether it's surfing, surf travel, surf tourism. What are some of the takeaways that you hope that your students leave Costa Rica with, for example?
When I think about something like surf tourism, whether we claim it sustainable or not, a lot of tourism is based on two things. One, what I like to call the right to ignorance, right? And, Bali's a perfect example. Again, going back to Scott Lederman, histories of genocide, dispossession, all that kind of stuff, right? And, tourism is designed to allow you to not see those things, right? Tourism is a form of erasure or elision, or whatever you want to call it, right? And the other is this idea of the production of innocence. So you see that a lot in places like Bali, in places like Costa Rica, and a lot of that innocence is produced around the idea of sustainability, right? So there was an article published a few years ago, that basically talked about sustainability as this empty signifier. It can be whatever you want it to be. And so you see in Bali this vogue for bamboo houses, right? They get touted as this wonderful, sustainable solution. And of course, you have to spray, tons of pesticides on that to kill the book. And in the meantime, you're not really doing anything meaningful about consumption in a meaningful way. Or, Costa Rica, people making, bridges for, howler monkeys, or starting recycling centers, right, to deal with all the gringo trash, but in ways that displace, families who derive their livelihoods from those same places where where recycling centers are established. So really, it's all about the will to know, to inform yourself. And for me, that's and again, as an educator and as a researcher, that's a really important starting point. It's perhaps just a starting point, not a ultimate panacea or anything like that, but it's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think this is where we kind of bridge that hyphen space between scholar activist, right? When we get questions like this, and sometimes from the critical perspective, it's like, we're doing critique, we don't need to provide the solutions, right? And I think that there's a lot of there's something to be said about that, right? The critique has a place as well, but I like also thinking through some of the solutions and thinking about what surfers can do in different places where they're traveling. And I think if surfers are able to adopt their own sort of critical perspective in the places where they're traveling, to recognize what they're seeing as connected to the larger whole, right? This isn't just one place where you're going to surf where this development conundrum is happening. That every time you go to surf, you see a lot of these similar issues happening. And how can we insert ourselves as surfers in these realities? Thinking about, if we are considering buying land in a place, what does that mean? And how is that going to impact the places where we are? I think, white saviorism plays a role often in sort of volunteer networks and surfers from the global north who are traveling to places and believing that they're really contributing to these places by being there, or, wanting to, save the places where they're going to surf. So I think, being reflective about that and kind of recognizing the issues behind it can prevent some of the colonial mindset that goes into some of that saviorism as surfers, beyond just, trying to get waves in the places where we're going. So that's what I would say, kind of thinking about how we can adopt our own critical perspectives as we're traveling and adjust our behaviors accordingly. And I think a possible way of doing that is supporting local, right? Really taking time to do the research of who are the actual locals in the places where you're traveling to surf. If they have businesses you can support, where the funds stay in the community, stay among local families, and not just, approach a place with dollar signs in your eyes and how you can own paradise, right? And that happens often. So that would be my kind of last word on this. So thanks again for giving us a microphone and a way to share some of our research and our ideas on your podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode with Tara and Pete, I'd like to invite you to check out my next episode, where I'll be talking about Canadian history with Dr. Donald Wright. Donald's a historian at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. And for this upcoming episode, we'll be chatting about his book, Canada, A Very Short Introduction, that he published as part of Oxford University Press's Very Short Introduction series. Hope to see you next time for this super exciting episode. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay stoked.